pleasure of introducing Dr. David Fischer. David Fischer represents a different era in the joint departments of economics and Department of Agricultural Resource Economics. Because a lot of people may not realize is that prior to 1983, we were one department. And so then I showed up here in 1985 after the split, and I will tell you just one quick story. I was from the University of Washington with the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics, which was actually at Washington State. So I had no idea about agricultural economics at all. In fact, when I came here, I said, who are those guys? Well, as it turns out, 4/5 of my research has been involved with people from this department, the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics. So I'm glad they're here. So David was the first graduate in 1968, and I'm just going to run through just his bio just real quickly, and then Stefan Kroll will talk. Still have a little feedback here. So David has been at the University of Rhode Island, University of Waterloo, Royal College of Business and Economics in Bergen, Norway, University of West Florida, California State University of Long Beach. He pointed out that you need to get a retirement fund going, so that's why he went to Cal State Long Beach. And then University of Baja in California, and also University of Cadiz in Spain, which I might mispronounce. He's also been involved with, as the PI and co-PI for 27 different grants and contracts over his career. He's been involved in writing and editing 10 books, and he's published approximately 100 referee journal articles. He's been a busy guy. What's interesting, and I'll turn it over to Stefan in a second, is that in his resume, he has single-authored publications and then joint publications. In today's world, everything is joint. So, but I'll just turn this over to Stefan to talk about his research.
Well, Harvey, we're glad too that you're here.
What?
So, but you were saying you're glad that we are here in our department. We're glad you're here too. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Let's see, no, wrong way. I just want to show you 6 paper titles here. Frameworks for analyzing the economic effects of climate change on outdoor recreation, and then Land and Leisure, Concepts and Methods in Outdoor Recreation. Environmental policy analysis for decision-making on the problems of environmental benefits and costs. Paired comparison estimates of willingness to accept versus contingent valuation estimates of willingness to pay. Willingness to pay as a behavioral criterion for environmental decision-making. Famous students from this university have written these papers. Any guess? So, the first 3 are by this guy, John Loomis. Seems to be talented, I don't know what happened to him. And sure enough, this was all in the 1990s and 2000, and sure enough, you look at the things down on the bottom. 1974, Fischer. 1975, Journal of Environmental Management. I hear that's a good journal, Chris. You have a couple of papers in there, right? So it's really amazing looking at your CV. It's really amazing to see how much you were ahead of your time. I mean, Ed can maybe say something about it, but environmental and resource economics really hasn't been, or wasn't at that time really that big, if it was existing at all. And you look at these papers and the paper titles, and clearly John Loomis and others gained from that early research in the 70s. So I think we're very glad that you are here. I don't know who is going to claim it more, your department or my department.
Well, Ken Nelson will have to talk about that.
No, we will talk about that. And yeah, it's all you. Thank you for coming.
Let me try to click the working for him. I think it's probably years.
Visible? Yeah.
Okay.
For me, it's absolutely amazing to be here. 50 years ago, I had no idea that I'd ever be returning here as your guest, and that you'd be interested in something I'd have to say. When I first got this invitation, I had to creak open the closet doors to find the museum of my career and then pry open the doors, because I pretty much thought of it as a mausoleum, but now it's reverted back to the museum, and I'm opening it up to you today is for you to take it as you wish. But first of all, I want to thank the university here, the Colorado State University, and all the investments that have been made here in the people and in infrastructure. I mean, it's amazing, and it's made my degree even better than it was 50 years ago. So I thank the deans, the chairpersons, the faculty, the grad students for being here, and I hope what I have to say will be of interest in a historical sense. And I want to ask each of you to think back 50 years ago, because CSU was quite different. The culture surrounding the economics department was very different. And out of that culture in that department from 1965 to 68 when I was here, you know, my career was forged and I launched it. So if you'll bear with me, you saw pictures of the past here at CSU. I hope this will never be a picture of the future. That a degraded environment.
It's yourself, not that is.
We should never be too popular. So I'm going to talk to you about the concept that has always been important to me, you know, once I launched into my career, and that's a trans-disciplinary approach to economics. I was struck when I first began to study economics that economics shares a root word with two other concepts or fields of interest. There's economics, ecology, and the ecumenical approach to life. So the Greek word of oikos, or the household, we have costs and benefits in economics. In ecology, we're concerned with physical interactions. And in an ecumenical approach, we're interested in the moral, or what is fair. Now, looking at these separately, we see that they're not carried forward into our research or into our policy or being implemented anywhere. If we base everything on willingness to pay, we end up with some injustices. If we base ecologic decisions on willingness to play, we get destruction. And the last dimension is completely ignored because it's so splintered. So there's two issues from my perspective here. One is a separation of the disciplines, and the other is there's no common value for integrating environment into development decision making. So I argue, or have argued in bits and pieces. This is the first time I'm pulling all this together from my museum, by the way. There's a need for balance. And rather than assuming that the earth was made for us to use any way we want, we should see us as made for the earth. We are earthlings, we are born, we live, we die, but the earth continues. So there's a need for a unifying standard to replace willingness to pay. Using ability to sustain, ATS, would emphasize the conservation of earth resources. And in my career, I wasn't able to get as deep into that as I wanted to, but that's part of your future. Sustainability depends, though, on satisfying a multi-actor, multi-arena cluster of witnesses with varying degrees of interest and influence. So it's very complex when you start talking about actually implementing the concept of sustainability. To begin with this, as an academic, I suggest that we need to move beyond our disciplinary boundaries into what I call a trans-disciplinary approach. We're all familiar with our discipline, whether it's psychology or economics or anthropology or political science. And we talk sometimes about multidisciplinary, and that typically means each specialist works on the same topic. They may or may not coordinate. Then we have cross-disciplinary, where one discipline dips into another discipline to take out what they want and apply that to their field. We have interdisciplinary, which the disciplines tend to be coordinated together by some concept, whichever disciplines has the most money, usually. And then we get to transdisciplinary, which in this I see the boundaries separating us by discipline becoming more permeable, that they're not as important, and that we work together in a unifying way to tackle the issue before us, whether it's sustainability or something else. The CZM, this is from an old diagram from a course I had, so this stands for Coastal Zone Management. So to follow up, the economics typically deals with resource development. Ecologic, resource conservation. Ecumenical could deal with avoiding hazards, either technological or natural. So out of that thinking, there's a challenge for economists, and I'm saying that I don't think we need more economists to move with discipline, but economists who can move their discipline, move it beyond its boundaries. The great question for an economist, I think, is who is being served by what we do and for what end? It's not the Pareto optimum, because to search for that, we have to follow very limiting assumptions which don't play out in the real world. And if we focus on private enterprise and commerce, it turns out to be rather ugly over time, because commerce tends to dominate our lives, and it's tempting to make a virtue out of self-interest. When you really look at self-interest, it can be seen as a vice and leads to the loss of communal values. And if there's anything confronting our society today, it's a loss of community, a loss of communal values. Thus, the question is, what is it by which we live, and what is its end? This was a cartoon I found not too long ago in a newspaper, where an attempt is made to explain a climate change model, and then the interesting diagram is up there in the second to the last. Well, then we take that output, run it through long-term economic models of the sort of who have never been right. And what if we don't trust the model? Well, who hired that science denier? Complexity. When I was in economics, we had HH for household, F for firm, G for government, and then we looked at that interplay and, okay, fine. But in reality, it's more like this. In this quadrant, if we have the proponents from a particular project or development program, it's going to be the sponsoring government agency, they'll be the developers and their allies, and then supporting them but having less power will be those that benefit from the outputs, which will be other allies, suppliers, employees, residents. In between, we have legislators, regulators, and then we have experts in the field and the media. And then if it's a development program we're looking at, we have the opposition from an environmental agency, from environmentalists who are organized in different ways, and their allies. And then we have those that would be impacted negatively by the project, residents, other resource uses. So this array of actors comes more to grips with the kind of reality that we face in trying to do work that has to be implemented. So my approach, once you begin to map that out, is to then look at putting together a problem-solving group who work on different definitions of the problem depending upon which actors we want to include, and then we try to model the problem by looking at the interrelationships among all of the different actors and trying to map out what impacts are seen as good and what are less good or bad, and then begin to put boundaries around our problem to make it solvable. And then communicating with the actors, we determine objectives, what's important for achieving those objectives, what kinds of alternatives that would satisfy those criteria, and then doing evaluations, recommendations, communications, and then evaluation of our problem-solving process. And this isn't done once. This is done once, twice, thrice, 4, 5. It's an iterative process that's done several times until you achieve a result that's capable of being implemented because it satisfies the objectives of the actors which had been in conflict. Now, just to summarize my contributions to theory, and I won't just say economic theory, but I think social science theory, is that multi-actor decision-making surrounds every cluster of decisions. And you don't usually have one decision, you have a sequence of decisions. And those sequences will be dominated perhaps even by different actors. So we end up with different kinds of equilibria. Every cluster contains a different value set for every decision sequence. Then the other thing that I did, which was being quoted by my colleague, was trying to integrate externalities into economic theory as it was understood at the time. And then switching over to the reality of the different case studies that I've been involved in, I discovered that for successful implementation, there needs to be a reticulist, which is a Latin word for a networker. Someone who can be trusted to network through conflicting decision spaces in order to coordinate an outcome which will be acceptable to every actor. And there are some examples. I mentioned one example this afternoon or earlier to the graduate students in the dealing with the Canadian Army. And the other thing is, I think it's very important to ground our theory in case studies. Let's bring the real world into our field. Career lessons that I've learned is that for me, the greatest learning I ever did was at the edge of the discipline, where it was fading out and merging into something else. That working in teams of those trained differently than myself was far better in the learning process than trying to sit at my desk with a computer. That case studies force you to revise your assumptions. And being contrary can get you fired. That happened to me. I've been fired before. I've also been tenured twice. So, it depends. One issue is that American universities aren't organized for this kind of work. Everything is in a discipline. And quite frankly, it was sad for me to learn that we now have 2 departments of economics instead of 1. That tells me that it's very hard to get out of the disciplinary box. And we ought to be willing to change direction beyond what we thought might be true. The most fragile actors and environments need our emphasis. We can't expect a clear path to our next step. It takes a lot of work to move from one step to the other. And we need to learn to fail better every time we do a study by rethinking our approach. Now that is, for those of you who have to leave early, that's the thrust of my theoretical part. For those of you who are willing to stay for the rest, let me just start off by saying that the man who I credit for being launched in natural resource economics is John Oz. I don't know, has anybody heard of John Oz? One man in the back. Thank you, sir. He was born in the Kansas sod house in 1885. He was educated at Harvard University as an economist. He was at the University of Kansas for his career. He wrote the first books on economics of forestry, and then later oil. This was in the 1920s, and then national parks in I think 59 or 60. He wrote an economics textbook in the 40s. He used the historical institutional approach. He was a student of Mark Twain, had a full collection of almost everything that Mark Twain wrote, and he lectured just like Mark Twain wrote. So he was a fascinating professor. He was a guest at the place where I took my bachelor's, my senior year, 58, 59. And through him, I really got excited to be a natural resource economist. Now, the faculty that I knew personally at CSU from 65 to 68 was, first of all, Steve Smith, who was the chair. He recruited me. I just finished my master's at Michigan State in resource development, and he asked me to come to work on a regional forest problem, which I'll mention more about later. Then there was Don Seastone, who was involved very much in introductory economics, microeconomics. Don, as I understand, went to Calgary right after I left. Bud Hartman, who was interested in economic history, microeconomics. Rufus Hughes, who was in development economics. David Seckler in growth and macro. Paul Barkley, who was here my first year in resource economics. Ted Tong, who was here my first year in regional economics. And then Ken Noby came my second year here. And Steve Smith dropped me into Ken's lab, so I was the first student he had. And I don't know what he knew what to make of me or not, but anyway, there I was. Now, one of the things you got to keep in mind is the social context of the years that I was a graduate student. We had civil rights riots in this country in almost every major city. President Johnson expanded the war in Vietnam. We had marches about that. In fact, we had one here at Fort Collins where a man actually drove his truck into the crowd, but luckily no one was killed. And we had the murders of two great Americans, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. That was played out on the campus because older faculty stood for status quo, younger faculty were agitating about the war, civil rights, and so forth. In fact, one of the young economists that was in the department was fired for participating in the Selma March. So it was not a peaceful time, either in the country or at CSU. My first year here was in 1965. I was one of two people brought into the doctor program. I worked for Steve Smith, who had a grant from the experiment station on national forest recreational decision making. In each case, I'm going to give you my salary so you can see what I did or didn't do, whether I was a true economic man. So for $300 a month, I brought my wife and 3 children here, and And we had a first place was on South Bryan for $90 rent. Then I took economic theory, regional economics, resource economics, public finance, calculus. But the thing that is important, and I stress that to graduate students, I used every term paper requirement in every course to focus on my dissertation. And I appreciate the faculty allowing me to do that. The second year, the first person that joined with me for the doctoral program, he disappeared. The second year, there was another one that took his place, and Steve Smith left, and then Ken Noby inherited me. I continued with economic theory, history, development, growth, decision organization, and French reading. I completed the theoretical framework of my dissertation. I commuted to Boulder to take Spanish reading. And that summer, I passed both language exams. It's interesting, there was no economics books in either language, so I used a French algebra book and a Spanish algebra book for my reading, so the reading was not that difficult. Then I took my comprehensive exams. There was 2.5 days, half a day on one on regional, one on resource, one on micro, one on macro, and I forget what the other one was. And then I passed my oral exam over that. This was one of my motivating factors. Notice the date on that cartoon. November 19th, 1967. I cut that out and I carried it with me for all these years. Unless you were a PhD, scram. So that was part of my motive for working hard without learning to ski or doing other things on campus, because I wanted that doctorate. And also I had 3 lovely children. That was a picture taken that same year, getting ready for Easter Sunday church service. Okay, now you have in front of you, you have the handout, and I'm going to go through these quickly. My pay was raised $100. I got $400 a month as a research associate once I went past everything. I was also joined by 3 other students, and I know 2 of them finished. I don't know about the other one. We moved to this building. I started to do interviews in the National Forest to get the data that I needed to fill in the blanks on my theoretical framework. I worked in the regional office of the Forest Service in Denver for 2 two-week periods to learn how they actually did it, and then to actually help them with this linear programming model that I had. And then we discussed how that would be implemented. It was fun. Then I wrote a first draft, gave it to Ken, and while he was struggling with that, I took off and decided I'd skip forestry and I'd look at oceans. So I went to the East Coast because when I was in the military, I loved living on the East Coast. I could get the sunny New York Times right away. It took 3 days to get it here. So anyway, I came back, got the criticisms of Ken, and I did the second draft, and then we had the meeting over that, and I passed. Tried to write a bulletin for the experiment station, and Dwayne Lloyd, I think, was in charge of that, and I never heard back from him, so I guess it was okay. Just some comments about CSU. I never had close contact with the faculty when I was here. They had a sea of 20 master's students, and were focused on them. And I was sort of an anomaly. No one knew what to do with me. So I knew what I wanted to do, so I just got down and worked. And I received no training in benefit cost analysis. When I finished the program, I thought that was odd. So the first course I set up at University of Rhode Island was a seminar on benefit cost analysis, because I could use that to learn it. And I thought I knew what I didn't know, or knew what I didn't know, or whatever it was, but I knew more of what I didn't know, which made me nervous than what I thought I knew. But anyway, I decided to go to University of Rhode Island. You can look on your thing if there's anything. Notice my salary. I was the first faculty person hired there in over 15 years under the Sea Grant program, which had just been approved, and I made $1,000 a month. So up from 400 to 1,000 was a good deal in my view. I was split 50-50 between economics and oceanography, and that was a disaster. So here was an attempt to actually bridge disciplines, but it was difficult because, for one thing, being the first new faculty person there and being young, at 30, when all these others were in their 50s, they never really never really saw me as a faculty member. And then the oceanographers could not grasp economics. I was trying to construct a production function, but you have to do that. If you're talking about, they wanted to preserve the wetlands, the Sportina ultramiflora, Sportina patens. And I was saying, okay, so if you had this much, if you had a hectare of the Sportina patens, what does it contribute to the production of marine life? Well, they couldn't tell me. And I said, well, what if we had half a hectare? Well, they couldn't tell me that either. I said, a square meter. And they couldn't tell me that either. So I had to give up the idea of using economic theory to look at the values of wetlands. And then in the economics department, I was given a project that no one else wanted, which was the wetland impacts of residential housing. So I had to devise questionnaires, and which I did. I wrote several articles, a bulletin. I did out of the questionnaires, did a willingness to pay study, and found out that not very many people were willing to pay a tax to preserve wetlands. So I wrote an article on the opportunity cost of protecting them, which infuriated every faculty person there. Then I had discovered environmental economics earlier, but I decided I worked out a beautiful course outline, submitted it to the curriculum committee, and it was rejected. So I got a phone call about the same time from Canada, where a former graduate student from Michigan State, who is now a chair at the University of Waterloo, he called me and said, "Do you want to come up and join a new environmental studies unit?" And I said, "How quick can I get there?" So I resigned from Rhode Island. I went to the University of Waterloo. Waterloo, for those of you who don't know, is basically the MIT of Canada. It has an incredible computer science faculty. They're the ones that invented the BlackBerry. You used to see President Obama with all the time and so forth. And I got promoted to associate professor right away, and I was given $30,000 a year as opposed to $9,000. That was a big jump for me. Tax-free the first year and a half. I was the only environmental economist at UW, and there were only 10 in the entire country of Canada. So I had my work cut out for me. My main job was to represent economics in the creation of a Bachelor of Science curriculum for environmental studies. And so it was bringing together the physical environment, the perceptual environment, social environment. The other faculty were involved were ecology, anthropology, sociology, communications, wildlife conservation, and an engineer. So there was those of us trying to create this Bachelor of Science. At that time we called it man-environment. Since then that's changed to just environmental studies. And then once I was tenured, I was appointed as an adjunct in the economics department. which is where I met Joan Robinson, because she had a daughter who lived in Ontario and was on a farm, and I had a great time talking with Joan Robinson. She's the one that told me, whenever you have a choice, take both. Okay. My first summer there was I was asked to go to the OECD to represent Canada and to be the key staff person on interviewing different countries' water ministries on how they were conceived of or perceived environment. And so I got to fly to different countries interviewing key people, wrote my report, we had a major conference on it, and I got to present the keynote paper. Then Ontario Industrial Development along the Great Lakes. I was involved in the planning of projects there. Science Council of Canada had me work on projects on how to integrate environment into the Arctic planning for the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and mining on Baffin Island, offshore oil development on the east coast of Canada. Energy Canada had me doing some forecasting of energy futures for Canada. So this led to books, articles, and so forth. I did most of my economics writing during this period. And then I took a sabbatical to IASA. IASA, or the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, was a creature of the time. President Johnson and Brezhnev set this up. 40% American scientists, 40% Soviet scientists, and then 10% Eastern Europe, 10% Western Europe. So it was quite a mix of people. And my first, when I was brought in, I was assigned to the Technology Management Unit. I was the only economist. Everyone else was an engineer or an operations researcher. We participated in these interdisciplinary case studies of national development schemes. The first one was at the Angara River development in Siberia. So during the summer of 1976, I spent 3 months in the Soviet Union, about a month in Moscow, and then over to Irkutsk, and then to Bratsk, and Ust-Ilimsk, and then to Akademkorydok, and Sevastopol, I think, I don't remember, one other place. And I had to interview various people. I had an official young PhD who was my translator. And so I was in charge of the environmental aspects. You know, what were the environmental impacts of building these huge dams on the Angara River, as well as the paper mill on Lake Baikal. Then we did that report, and I was interviewed by the Soviet delegation. They said I was anti-Soviet. And I said, no, I don't think I was. I was just trying to translate for everybody else what you do. Anyway, the next study was looking at the bullet train extension going from Tokyo to Hokkaido, which was going to go through rural mountains underneath the sea and then up into Hokkaido. And we were looking at the environmental impacts there, which were basically noise impacts as well as impacts along the route of, going a straight line through, hilly terrain and digging out a tunnel. And that too was a difficult assignment. I spent again about 3 months in Japan interviewing Japanese scientists and engineers and so forth. And the thing I learned there was so interesting was that after World War II, Japan was specifically not allowed to develop aeronautical engineering. And so all their aeronautical engineers turned to trains. So they have a fantastic train system. What do we need to do in our country to get a fantastic train system? Okay, next question. Then, because I had worked on the Canadian Arctic, on the in oil. I came up with the idea, why don't we do a North Sea oil development? Because oil was discovered in the North Sea at the same time environment became popular, about 1979. So I wanted to see, well, let's see how these two different countries, Britain and Norway, handled all of that. The Brits were unhappy with me asking them questions, but the Norwegians were very eager and cooperative. Had a great time, particularly in Norway at that time, and put on a conference, and we wrote a book about that. Then, while I was there interviewing the scientists and the engineers, they were saying that oil blowouts are a thing of the past. We have superior technology and superior training, and therefore we don't even think about accidents. I got back to EASA, and 2 weeks later they had the Bravo blowout, which you probably don't remember, because maybe most of you weren't born yet. But it was the first major blowout on an offshore platform, well, the first one in Europe ever. And so I immediately jumped in an airplane, went back up there, and sat with the Norwegian group who was trying to handle that. It turned out to be a former student of mine that I'd had at Waterloo years ago. At any rate, I learned a lot. And so I came back to EASA and I started a new program called, looking at large-scale technological accidents. And then around that time, 3 Mile Island occurred. And so I again hopped in an airplane, went to Pennsylvania, Washington, and interviewed a lot of people, discussed things, and came back and wrote that up. And of course then Chernobyl happened, but then I had already left EASA. So out of all that work, I wrote a lot of research bulletins, book chapters, joint articles, gave talk to international scientists, and including 3 Nobel economists who were in the audience when I was giving my findings on my reports. And I formed a short relationship with Herbert Simon, who had just gotten the prize. He was wonderful then. And I drafted 2 books on North Sea oil and environment, one on the accident and one on the operations. I also got divorced there. Can't do all that work and be a family man. At least I could. Then I went to Norway, and I had a joint appointment in the Industrial Economics Institute and the Royal School of Business and Economics. I was hired as a research professor for $42,000. I finished my 2 books, and I got them each published. Norway published the operations one, and Britain published the accident one. I started a research program on North Sea oil issues for Norway, and wrote research bulletins on how to organize to do multidisciplinary research, and another program on how the North Sea was impacting local economies in Norway. But the issue I found was it was too isolating an environment for me. I'm too social. I asked one of my colleagues one time, I said, hey, can I buy you beer with $8 a glass in Norway? So I asked him, can I take you out for a beer? So that was a pretty good, pretty good offer. And he said, no. And I said, oh. I said, when would that be? Because we were pretty good friends in the office. He said, well, I have my family. I said, oh, okay. And he said, besides, I've had all the friends I've ever wanted from kindergarten. So they don't make new friends. So I did, and it's also very expensive to travel to other places. So I decided to leave. I wanted to also be closer to my children. I had a hard time finding a place, being a full professor, white male, but I finally did in political science of all places for $32,000. So that was a drop in pay to come back to the United States. I was assigned to head an office of coastal studies and to fund it because my salary was taken away for something else that was off the books. And so I had to earn my own money, which was okay with me. I went to the state government and first of all, talked to the state senator, who forged my pathway into the bureaucracy in Tallahassee, and I ended up with 2 contracts. One to create a Sandy Beach Atlas, and the other to assess storm preparedness for Sandy Beach counties. So this was definitely multidisciplinary work. And the chair of political science demanded that I use all that money to fund our students in political science. And you see a political scientist drawing a map? I couldn't, so I said no. So I hired geographers to do the mapping. I hired geologists to provide the input for that, sedimentologists, oceanographers, and I worked with them to create an index for use to rate areas of the different Sandy Beach counties for protection or development. The chair was angry. He forced me to apply for tenure and then fixed it so I wouldn't be tenured, so I got fired. And so my response to that was to buckle down and write more journal articles and just lots of job applications. And on the day I got my last check, I got a written offer from Cal State Long Beach, which was not necessarily a great place for my person, my background, but it gave me a wonderful pension. Thank you, California. So I went there at 48,000, which is a big jump from 32. And when I retired in 98 from there, I retired at 67. So I don't know how that matches with what you make here. I had to teach 5 courses a semester. That was the bad news. But my courses that I did teach were, since I used my experience to teach the courses, were the most popular in the center. What really was frosting on the cake for me was I got a position with a federal agency as a Schedule A, which means part-time, as a GS-14 economist, working on international minerals, ocean minerals. So that led to a wealth of information, and I wrote a lot of articles on ocean mineral development and the issues thereof, and then looking at shoreline hazards from storms in Southern California and in Mexico. It was a strange place, this center, because the dean was a very insecure man who kept the full-time faculty very small in order to control them, and then he used adjunct faculty for most of the students, which was pretty good for the students because this were experienced men from the outside. But he did not want to tenure me, and I knew that. So I volunteered to be a faculty senator, to work on the faculty union board, to work in the faculty mentoring program, and I applied for early tenure, and I got it over his objections. So as soon as that was over with, I took a sabbatical and went to the University of Cantabria in northern Spain, wonderful place, and did a study of coastal counties there planning for sea level rise. I got back from there, and then I was offered a summer appointment in Stockholm at the Institute of Future Studies, working on the issue there was they had banned nuclear power and were going to switch to biofuels. And so I did a quick study and realized that their nuclear development was far superior to what we were doing in the United States. And they were, to my view, crazy to shut it down. And to switch to biofuels, which would mean knocking down all of their forests, which are hard to grow in a northern climate. So I put that out in a report and in an article, and that drew lots of anger and ire, but that's our job, isn't it? That's why we get tenured. I got rewards there, finally, and anyway, the best thing was I got Social Security and a California pension. Then in '92, I took a part-time work with the University of Baja California in Ensenada, and then I resigned in '98 to work full-time there. my salary dropped to 36,000, so you see I took a cut about 50% to go to Mexico. And there I was developing a coastal studies curriculum. I only had to teach one course a semester, that was good. And I worked on erosion, environment, hazards, ports, resorts, you name it, and winemaking, because I didn't work all the time. It turns out that that part of Mexico is the fine wine region, so I got to work in that a little bit. I co-directed an international environmental planning project, which gave me more travel to Spain and Argentina. Graduated 4 PhDs while I was there over a 10-year period and 10 master's degrees. I wrote 3 books, a textbook. Well, I wrote it first in English and then sat down with a colleague and we translated it into Spanish. I'm going to give you all a copy of this because you can, even if you don't know Spanish, by looking at the diagrams, you can figure out, what I'm trying to do, and I think that's, for the way I frame my studies. Then I took a visiting assignment at the University of Cadiz in Spain, and then again got some rewards. And then I met Carmen, a biogeochemist who now supports me in my old age. At the end, I was fired because one of my students, doctoral students, wanted to plagiarize his dissertation. I said no. And he was well connected to the director of the faculty, so. Okay, what happened to them? Looking back, these are the kind of lessons I think I've learned. One, get involved in real case studies and use that to validate your thinking. Our Earth is fragile, and it ought to be the basis for orienting theory. Being fired twice didn't matter. I also did tenure twice. And for me, tenure was never necessary because I was a hard-working guy, and this up-or-out system, I think, can work against people that work hard. If your work doesn't upset someone, then maybe you can question its value. Are you with or against the flow? International work is devalued in the United States, not seen as relevant, and yet for me it was my most valuable learning experiences. Try to step out of dualistic thinking, which is very prominent. Nothing is either or, good or bad, in or out. Work around people that threaten you or criticize you. It's their problem, not yours. See your disciplinary boundaries as your creative zone. Don't be afraid of unlearning and reorienting your economics. Your opportunity cost was the most useful concept in my work. And I found out that when you move, which I did frequently, that your friends disappear. And you only live once. So try to live a balanced life. Put your family in there, and then people, your earth, and then your economics. I shared this earlier with graduate students. If you're looking to get a new place in academia, these are some ideas for doing that. Creating a forum for your ideas. Don't worry about criticism. Get into different networks that don't have anything to do with economics that might have interest for you. Focus on what you're going to do at a conference. Attend other disciplinary conferences. Volunteer to work on area and regional committees. And try to publish in non-economic journals. Now, retirement. A lot of faculty that are older don't give up their positions because what am I going to do? Well, this is what I did. Over the last 10 years, I switched my attention to my bride's career and tried to support her in getting her started. I became engaged in a local church, teach classes, acting as an assistant minister in some cases. Travel. We go to Mexico. We have a house in San Miguel de Allende in Guanajuato, and we travel there frequently. Every other year, we go to Europe for a month. I'm a new grandfather. I've got 2, ages 5 and 3 in San Antonio, which take up every weekend. I have 2 in Oakland, California, 12 and 5, which take up a big part of the summers. And then my oldest is in northern Michigan. I don't see her often enough. I sing in a German choir once a week. We have practice for an hour and a half. And we have monthly Sonderfests. We go on concert trips. We went on one to northern Germany just last July. And self-reflection. I like to think over myself. I thought about myself and came up with a book. My family hated it. So if you write something and it doesn't get somebody angry, it must be good. So anyway, I'm going to leave that book, these 2 books with you. And this is a IASA, after I left, put together a bulletin because they liked my work on accidents. And I compared 3 Mile Island to the North Sea blowout, and you would think, what do they have in common? Turns out they had a lot in common. So I'm going to give you a copy of that. It's my second to last one of that. And, okay. I don't know if Keynes said this or not, but this quote is attributed to him. And I like it. When my information changes, I alter my conclusions. What do you do? Now this is for me. To produce an economic study and not experiment with another discipline is a lost learning opportunity. If what you wrote doesn't make somebody angry, then you haven't moved beyond your discipline much. Remember that the earth was here before us, and to the earth we will return, dust to dust. We have been made for the earth, not the earth for us. The earth should be the primary focus in our economics, which includes respect for the real people who live on it. And finally, a quote from Ecclesiastes, I think is important. There's no end to the publishing of books, and constant study wears you out so you're no good for anything else. So that's a word to the wise. Seek a balance in your life as a whole. You are more than an academic. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. That was fantastic.
Yeah, really good.
I don't know if we have any questions, or if we do have a question, we are going to have cake, right? And as a side, we have an award, or maybe we have the award, and on the side we have cake, either one. And that's going to be over in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics, but the people from the Department of Economics are invited as well. So.
Member here. Norm Dahlstead is also a member, and John Loomis is our final member. John and Norm weren't able to be here today, but they said their congratulations and their regrets for not being here. But the committee reviewed Dr. Fischer's material and unanimously recommended to the faculty that he be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And the faculty reviewed his material and unanimously supported that recommendation. So we're very happy that Dr. Fischer is here today. As you know, we heard through some of his discussion and some of his earlier introductions, he got his Bachelor's of Science in Business with a minor in Economics from Trinity University in San Antonio, and then spent some time in the Air Force.
Yes.
Right? And then from there got a master's degree in Michigan State in resource development. And then came to Fort Collins and did his PhD here. So he was the first graduate of the joint departments in 1968.
By the way, his dissertation.
There you go. That's pretty impressive. So in 1968, got his PhD as the first graduate of the joint department. And so we're really pleased to have him here. As Harvey, I think, explained, he's taught at the University of Rhode Island, Waterloo in Ontario, in Norway, Western Florida. Some of these went better than others, apparently. California State University, Long Beach, University of Baja California in Ensenada, Mexico, and also in Spain. And as he described his work, deals with the environmental and social impacts of marine resource issues. On the East Coast, looking at coastal land use and wetlands. In Canada, industrial siting and the impacts on regional coastal regions. As he mentioned, looking at oil, petroleum, gas lines in the North Sea. Florida, looking at beaches, beach development and access. California, as he mentioned, looking at the mineral development there, and local responses to oil spills and coastal protection, hazard avoidance, like he told us. And in Spain and Mexico, looking at coastal issues as well and energy policy. As Harvey brought to our attention, he has 100 publications, 9 books, and many scholarly awards. He also has received awards for his teaching efforts and has clearly been engaged with his students and has a lot to teach all of us, I think. And his work has clearly had a lot of impact in policy, and so he has clearly been an outstanding economist and human and interested in what's going on with our world. And so we're really pleased to induct him into the Hall of Fame. We have an award for him that we'll present to him. So let's take a picture, Denise.
Carmen, you want to get next to him, please?
Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, you want me to take it with your camera?
Yeah, I was just kind of filming.
Award.
Come on.
Very good.
Here we go.
And we have the Hall of Fame award that will stay here with us, with his photo and with a blurb that he got to help edit, describing his career and his contributions. And so congratulations and welcome to our Hall of Fame, and thank you for your presentation and all your work. Very good. So just to get to spend a little more time with David and his wife and a little fellowship, we have cake and water. Oh, I'm sorry, and Anita has a presentation, I'm sorry. Yes.
So not a full presentation, but the Department of Economics would like to send you home with some goodies as well. And so we have one of the CSU blankets, which we have actually had embroidered by Harvey's lovely wife, who I heard that you had dinner with last night. And so it's embroidered on here for Dr. David Fischer, a distinguished alumni, and it also has today's date on it as well, so something to remember this event by as well. So I want to point out that from your presentation, you mentioned in your presentation that you had a little bit of disappointment that the two departments split over time. But I really wanted to thank you for bringing us together today and helping, support some of this joint activity with us. So thank you, David.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, and we have T-shirts and stuff like that as well. So lots of goodies to remember.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll put that in my office. Well, let's put it down right here.
It's $49 to return on Frontier.
Have them ship it.
That's that.
Well, thank you very much. It's sometimes, a lot of times you walk away from doing a study and you wonder, what happened really. But an experience like this makes everything worthwhile, even being fired.
Don't get any ideas.
No, thank you.
Don't get
No, but he can. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.